Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
The Coins on the Dead Man's Eyes, a Hercule Poirot mystery, a Cozy Mysteries production. Hello and welcome to Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, your narrator for today's tale of intrigue and deduction. What I'm about to share with you unfolded during a particularly grey London autumn, when the fog seemed to seep into every corner of the city, carrying with it whispers of secrets and shadows. Chapter 1. The Silent Sentinel. Our story begins in the heart of the financial district, where Threadneedle Street bustles with the urgent commerce of Britain's banking elite. It was here, in the imposing Georgian edifice that housed Pemberton and Associates, private banking, that death came calling on a Tuesday morning in October. The small Belgian detective with a distinctive egg-shaped head and carefully waxed moustache had been enjoying his morning tisane when the urgent telephone call arrived. Inspector Japp's voice crackled through the receiver with barely contained excitement. "Poirot, we've got ourselves a real puzzle down in the city. A banker has been found dead at his desk, but it's not just any ordinary death. Someone's gone and placed gold coins over his eyes, like something out of an old Greek funeral." The detective's green eyes immediately sharpened with interest. Such theatrical touches invariably spoke of deeper meanings, of personal vendettas dressed in ritual clothing. He set down his delicate china cup with precision and reached for his overcoat. "Most intriguing, mon ami. I shall be with you directly." The victim was Mr. Reginald Pemberton, senior partner of the firm that bore his name. At 62, he had been a pillar of London's financial community, known for his discretion with wealthy clients and his unfailing punctuality. His secretary, Miss Caroline Hartwell, had discovered the body when she arrived at precisely 9 to prepare his morning correspondence. The scene that greeted the detective was indeed extraordinary. Pemberton sat slumped in his leather chair behind the massive mahogany desk, his head tilted back as if he had simply fallen asleep while working. But for the 2 gleaming gold sovereigns that covered his closed eyes, one might have thought him merely resting. The office showed no signs of struggle. Papers were neatly arranged, the crystal inkwell sat undisturbed, and not so much as a pencil lay out of place. Yet something was distinctly wrong, beyond the obvious presence of death and its strange ornamentation. "The safe remains locked," Japp explained, gesturing toward the imposing steel vault built into the wall behind the desk. "We've had the company's locksmith verify it hasn't been tampered with. But here's the curious thing. All of Pemberton's account books have vanished. Not one ledger or client file can be found in the entire office." The detective moved with careful deliberation around the desk, his eyes taking in every detail. The coins were freshly minted sovereigns, their gold surfaces catching the pale morning light that filtered through the tall windows. They had been placed with almost reverential care, positioned perfectly over each closed eyelid. "Tell me of the discovery, Inspector. Who has had access to this office?" "Miss Hartwell found him just after 9. She has keys to the outer office, but not to Pemberton's private study here. She had to wait for the building superintendent to unlock it. Claims she called out several times before getting worried about the silence." The detective knelt beside the desk, his keen nose detecting the faintest trace of something unusual. Beneath the typical office scent of leather and paper, there was something else. A medicinal smell, perhaps chloroform, though so faint as to be almost undetectable. "And the staff? Who else works in these premises?" 3 clerks in the main office, plus Miss Hartwell's secretary. There's also Mr. Pemberton's business partner, Mr. James Whitmore, but he's been in Edinburgh on business since Sunday. We've verified his alibi thoroughly. Moving to examine the windows, the detective noted they were firmly locked from the inside, their heavy frames showing no signs of forced entry. The door to the office bore a substantial lock, and only Pemberton himself and Miss Hartwell possessed keys. "Most curious," he murmured, his accent lending a musical quality to the words. "We have here a locked room, a ritualistic killing, and missing documents that suggest our murderer sought something specific, yet nothing of obvious value appears to have been taken." He paused before a small side table where a tea service sat untouched, the cup still containing cold liquid. A slight brown residue stained the bottom of the cup, barely visible unless one looked closely. "Inspector, I would like to speak with Miss Hartwell and examine these missing account books more thoroughly. There is something here that speaks not of random violence, but of careful planning, an intimate knowledge of the victim's habits. As they prepared to leave the death chamber, the detective took one last look at the peaceful face of Reginald Pemberton. The coins gleamed like closed golden eyes, giving the banker an almost regal appearance in death. But beneath this classical dignity, the detective sensed something far more personal and immediate. "The coins," he said softly, "they tell us much about our killer. This is no ancient ritual mindlessly copied. This is a message, Inspector, written in the currency of the dead." Chapter 2. The Secretary's Testimony. Miss Caroline Hartwell proved to be a woman of remarkable composure for someone who had discovered her employer's body mere hours earlier. She sat in the firm's reception area, her grey wool dress impeccably neat, her silver hair arranged in a perfect chignon. Only the slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed her skirt betrayed any inner distress. The detective observed her carefully as Inspector Japp conducted the preliminary questioning. She had worked, for Pemberton and Associates for over 15 years, she explained, serving as Mr. Pemberton's personal secretary throughout that time. Her duties included managing his appointments, handling correspondence, and maintaining strict confidentiality regarding client affairs. "Tell me about yesterday evening, mademoiselle. What time did you depart the office?" "At 6 precisely, as always. Mr. Pemberton was still working when I left. He often stayed late, particularly on Mondays when he reviewed the previous week's transactions." Her voice carried the crisp efficiency of a woman accustomed to business matters, but the detective noted how her eyes avoided direct contact with his own. There was something she was not saying, some details she found difficult to express. "And this morning when you arrived, describe for me exactly what occurred." "I unlocked the outer office at 9 and prepared the morning post as usual. When I went to knock on Mr. Pemberton's door for his morning briefing, there was no answer. At first I assumed he might have stepped out, but his hat and coat were on the stand, and his briefcase was in its usual place." She paused, pressing a handkerchief to her lips before continuing. "I called out several times, growing increasingly concerned. That's when I summoned Mr. Matthews, the building superintendent, to unlock the door." The detective leaned forward slightly, his manner gentle but penetrating. "And you noticed nothing unusual about the office when you first arrived? No signs that anyone had been there during the night?" "Everything appeared normal in the outer office. The safe in Mr. Pemberton's room was closed and locked just as always. But—" She hesitated, glancing nervously at Inspector Japp. "But what, Miss Hartwell?" "The account ledgers were gone. Mr. Pemberton kept them in a locked cabinet beside his desk. The cabinet was standing open, and all the books had been removed. That's most irregular. Those records never leave the office." This detail clearly troubled her, more than the presence of the coins, the detective noted with interest. For a woman accustomed to rigid business procedures, the disappearance of important documents represented a fundamental violation of proper order. "These ledgers, they contained what information exactly?" "Client account records, transaction histories, investment portfolios. Mr. Pemberton handled very sensitive financial matters for his clients. Complete discretion was absolutely paramount to the firm's reputation." Inspector Japp consulted his notebook. "We'll need a complete list of all clients who had recent dealings with Mr. Pemberton. Were there any who seemed particularly agitated or dissatisfied?" Miss Hartwell's composure wavered slightly. "There was one matter that had been causing Mr. Pemberton considerable distress recently. A client named Mr. Blackwood had been making increasingly aggressive demands regarding his account. Mr. Pemberton had been staying late several evenings, reviewing Mr. Blackwood's files with great care." The detective's eyes sharpened. "What sort of demands?" "I couldn't say precisely. Mr. Pemberton was very discreet about client matters, but I did overhear part of a telephone conversation last week. Mr. Pemberton was explaining that certain investments had not performed as expected, and that some documents had been misfiled." Her hesitation over the final word was telling. The detective filed this detail away for later consideration. "This Mr. Blackwood, he visited the office recently?" "Last Friday afternoon. He was with Mr. Pemberton for nearly 2 hours. When he left, he seemed agitated. Mr. Pemberton was quite shaken afterward and cancelled his remaining appointments for the day." The detective rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the bustling street below. "Miss Hartwell, in your 15 years with Mr. Pemberton, Had you ever known him to remove account ledgers from the office? Never. Never under any circumstances. Those records were sacrosanct. Yet someone took them last evening or early this morning, someone who knew precisely where they were kept and had the means to remove them without disturbing anything else in the office. A new thought seemed to strike Miss Hartwell, and she turned pale. "The spare key," she whispered. "What spare key?" Mr. Pemberton kept a spare key to his office in the outer safe. Only he and I knew of its existence. If someone had forced him to reveal the combination... The detective exchanged a significant look with Inspector Japp. This was indeed a crucial piece of information. Someone had not merely killed Reginald Pemberton, they had compelled him to provide access to his most confidential records before his death. The ritualistic placement of the coins took on new significance in this light. They were not merely decorative touches, but a final message from a killer who had taken time to complete their business before arranging this theatrical farewell. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. One final question. The tea service in Mr. Pemberton's office, was it his habit to take refreshment while working late?" "Oh, yes. He always had a cup of chamomile tea before leaving in the evening. Said it helped him relax after a difficult day." She paused. "Though he did seem to be drinking more tea lately, sometimes having several cups during particularly stressful periods." As they left Miss Hartwell to her grief and shock, the detective felt the first threads of the case beginning to weave themselves into a recognizable pattern. The killer had been methodical, patient, and intimately familiar with both Pemberton's habits and the office's security arrangements. This was no crime of passion, but a carefully orchestrated execution. Chapter 3. The Client's Shadow. The address for Mr. Cornelius Blackwood led to an elegant townhouse in Belgravia, its white Georgian facade speaking of wealth and respectability. Yet, as the detective and Inspector Japp climbed the marble steps to the imposing front door, there was something about the property that suggested recent neglect. Paint slightly faded, brass fixtures lacking their proper gleam. The butler who answered their summons was a thin, nervous man whose eyes darted anxiously between his visitors before grudgingly admitting them to a drawing-room that, while tastefully appointed, showed subtle signs of financial strain. The silk curtains were beginning to fade, and several gaps on the walls suggested paintings had been recently removed. Mr. Blackwood himself proved to be a man of perhaps 50 years, tall and distinguished, with prematurely white hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Yet the detective's trained eye immediately noticed the signs of strain, the slight tremor in the man's hands, the way his eyes avoided direct contact, the defensiveness that crept into his voice even before any accusations were made. "Gentlemen, I assume this visit concerns poor Pemberton's death. Shocking business. Absolutely shocking. Though I must say, given the nature of his clientele, perhaps not entirely surprising." Inspector Japp consulted his notebook. "We understand you had recent business dealings with the deceased Mr. Blackwood. Several meetings over the past month, including one just last Friday." "Indeed. Pemberton had been managing certain investments for me, and I had grown concerned about their performance. The market has been particularly volatile this year." The detective, who had been silently observing the room's furnishings, turned his attention to their host. "These investments, monsieur, they were not performing to your satisfaction?" Blackwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's rather an understatement. Pemberton had convinced me to place a substantial portion of my capital in what he claimed were conservative, reliable ventures. Instead, I found myself facing significant losses." "How significant, if you don't mind my asking?" "Significant enough to threaten my family's financial security. The funds in question represented nearly my entire inheritance from my father's estate, plus additional monies I had borrowed against my property." The detective noted how Blackwood's hands clenched as he spoke, and how his eyes flickered toward a photograph on the mantelpiece showing a young woman in an elegant wedding gown. "Your daughter's wedding, perhaps?" "Yes. Margaret married young Lord Ashford last spring, a considerable expense, but necessary for the family's social standing." His voice carried a bitter edge. "An expense that Pemberton's investment failures now make difficult to bear." Inspector Japp leaned forward. "Mr. Blackwood, we need to know exactly what transpired during your meeting with Mr. Pemberton on Friday afternoon. Our information suggests it was a rather heated discussion." "Heated?" I suppose one might characterize it that way. I demanded to know precisely what had happened to my investments. Pemberton claimed there had been some unfortunate market conditions, but his explanations were vague and unsatisfactory. And what did you conclude from his evasiveness? Blackwood was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I began to suspect that my funds had been deliberately misappropriated, that Pemberton had used my money for other purposes, perhaps to cover losses in other clients' accounts. The detective's eyebrows rose slightly. That is a serious accusation, monsieur. Indeed it is, and one I intended to pursue through proper legal channels. I'd already consulted with my solicitor about the possibility of bringing charges. Yet you did not immediately involve the authorities. Pemberton begged for time to rectify the situation. He claimed he could recover the funds through other investments, given a few weeks to arrange matters properly. Against my better judgment, I agreed to wait. Inspector Japp made a note. Did he provide any guarantees for this recovery? He offered to provide detailed documentation of all transactions involving my account, said he would have the information ready by Tuesday. Today, in fact. We had arranged to meet again this morning. The detective had been studying a small writing desk in the corner of the room, noting the quality of the paper and ink supplies arranged upon it. "Mr. Blackwood, you correspond regularly with business associates?" "Certainly. My various commercial interests require considerable correspondence." "And you write in your own hand, or do you employ a secretary?" Blackwood seemed puzzled by the question. "For personal matters, I write myself." "Why do you ask?" Instead of answering, the detective moved to examine more closely the photograph of the young woman on the mantelpiece. "Your daughter appears to have made a most advantageous marriage." "Yes, though the associated costs were substantial. The wedding alone required expenditure of nearly £10,000, not counting the dowry settlement. A significant sum indeed, one that might create considerable financial pressure if other investments failed unexpectedly." Blackwood's face darkened. "Are you suggesting that I had something to do with Pemberton's death?" "That's preposterous." "I suggest nothing, monsieur. I merely seek to understand the full scope of your business relationship and the pressures it might have created." "Where were you last evening, Mr. Blackwood?" Inspector Japp asked directly. "Here at home. I dined alone and spent the evening in my study reviewing my financial papers in preparation for today's meeting with Pemberton." "Any servants who can confirm your presence?" "I dismissed the staff early yesterday evening. I preferred privacy while dealing with such sensitive matters." As they prepared to leave, the detective paused at the doorway. "One final question, if you please. Are you familiar with the old custom of placing coins upon the eyes of the deceased?" Blackwood's face went ashen. "Coins? What coins?" "2 gold sovereigns were found positioned over Mr. Pemberton's eyes, a most unusual touch, suggesting either classical education or personal significance." "I have no idea what that could mean. Some sort of ancient burial ritual, perhaps." But his voice lacked conviction, and the detective noted how his hand unconsciously moved to his waistcoat pocket, as if confirming the presence of something there. The threads of the case were beginning to form a more complex pattern. Chapter 4. The Forger's Art. The detective's next destination was the British Museum's Department of Manuscripts, where his old friend Dr. Geoffrey Whitcomb served as chief authenticator of historical documents. If anyone could shed light on the significance of gold coins placed over a dead man's eyes, it would be the scholarly gentleman who had spent his career studying ancient burial customs and their modern interpretations. Dr. Whitcomb, a spare man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers, greeted them in his cluttered office overlooking Great Russell Street. Ancient texts and modern reference works competed for space on every available surface, while detailed photographs of medieval manuscripts covered the walls. "Ah, Poirot, always a pleasure. And what mysterious artifact brings you to my domain today?" The detective described the scene at Pemberton's office, emphasizing the careful placement of the gold sovereigns and the ritualistic quality of the arrangement. Dr. Whitcomb listened with growing interest, occasionally consulting various reference works scattered across his desk. "Most fascinating," he murmured, pulling out a heavy volume on classical funeral practices. "The placement of coins over the eyes of the dead is indeed an ancient custom dating back to Greek and Roman times. The coins were meant to pay Haran, the ferryman who transported souls across the River Styx to the underworld. But in modern times, Doctor, would someone employ such symbolism today? Oh, absolutely. The practice survived well into the medieval period and beyond, particularly among certain educated classes who wished to invoke classical dignity for their departed. Even in our modern era, some families of classical education still observe such customs. Inspector Japp shifted impatiently. So we're looking for someone with knowledge of ancient Greek burial practices. Not necessarily, Dr. Whitcomb replied, adjusting his spectacles. The symbolism has evolved over time. In Victorian funeral practice, coins were sometimes placed on the eyes for purely practical reasons, to keep them closed during viewing. But the ritualistic aspect, the specific choice of gold sovereigns, suggests someone making a deliberate statement. The detective leaned forward with interest. What sort of statement, Doctor? Well, gold sovereigns are specifically British. Currency representing not just payment for the afterlife, but payment of debts incurred in this life. Someone might use such symbolism to suggest that justice had been served, that a debt had been properly settled. A debt of honour, perhaps, or a financial obligation. Either could apply. The key is the deliberate nature of the act. This wasn't casual decoration, but careful symbolism designed to convey a specific message to those who would understand its significance. As they prepared to leave the museum, Dr. Whitcomb made an additional observation that would prove crucial to the detective's understanding of the case. One more thing, my friend. The placement of coins over the eyes requires considerable care and precision. They must be positioned while the muscles are still relaxed, before rigor mortis sets in. Your killer either had medical knowledge or worked very quickly after death occurred. From the museum, they proceeded to the offices of Pemberton and Associates, where the detective wished to conduct a more thorough examination of the crime scene. The office building was nearly empty in the late afternoon, with only a few clerks still at their desks in the main banking hall. Miss Hartwell had departed for the day, but she had left the keys as promised. The detective used his own small torch to supplement the fading daylight streaming through the tall windows, examining every detail of Pemberton's private office with meticulous care. The desk yielded several interesting observations. Despite Miss Hartwell's assertion that nothing had been disturbed, there were subtle signs that someone had conducted a careful search. Papers had been moved and replaced, though so skillfully that only the most observant eye would notice the slight misalignment of edges and the faint impressions left on the leather desk pad. More significantly, the detective discovered traces of sealing wax near the desk lamp, fresh wax that suggested documents had been sealed recently, possibly that very evening. He collected several small flakes of the reddish wax for later analysis. The missing ledgers represented the most puzzling aspect of the case. Why steal account books when the safe containing actual currency and securities remained untouched? The detective concluded that the killer sought not monetary wealth, but specific information contained within those records. Inspector Japp, meanwhile, had been examining the lock on the filing cabinet where the ledgers had been stored. No signs of forcing, he reported. Whoever took these books had a key or knew the combination. Or convinced Mr. Pemberton to provide access, the detective replied thoughtfully. Consider the timeline, mon ami. Our victim was alive when his killer arrived, perhaps even invited them in. He was compelled to reveal where the account books were kept, possibly under threat of violence to others he cared about. Moving to the small side table where the tea service sat, the detective conducted a more thorough examination of the cup and its contents. The brown residue he had noticed earlier proved to be more significant than first appearance suggested. Using a small magnifying glass, he could discern particles that were clearly not tea leaves. Inspector, I believe we will find that Mr. Pemberton's evening tea was augmented with a substance designed to render him unconscious. Chloral hydrate, perhaps, or laudanum. Something that would incapacitate him long enough for the killer to complete their business. You mean he was drugged before being murdered? Indeed, and afterward, the killer placed the coins with ceremonial care, completing whatever symbolic message they wished to convey. As they locked the office and prepared to depart, the detective summarized his growing understanding of the crime. We have here a killer who possessed intimate knowledge of Mr. Pemberton's habits and procedures, someone who could gain entry without arousing suspicion, who knew precisely where important documents were stored, and who understood the symbolic significance of ancient burial customs. That sounds like someone with both personal and professional connections to the victim. Precisely, Inspector. Someone who had been trusted with confidential information and who felt that trust had been betrayed. The coins represent not random ritual, but calculated justice, payment for services rendered, and debts that could never be repaid through conventional means. The fog was beginning to lift from London streets as they emerged from the building. The detective felt they were only beginning to see clearly through the mists of deception that surrounded Reginald Pemberton's death. Chapter 5. The Widow's Tale. Mrs. Helena Pemberton received them in the morning room of her Kensington home, a tastefully appointed space that reflected the refined tastes of London's banking elite. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, dressed in deep mourning attire that emphasized her pale complexion and prematurely silver hair. Despite her obvious grief, she maintained the composed dignity that befitted the widow of a prominent financier. The detective observed her carefully as she poured tea from an elegant silver service, noting the slight tremor in her hands and the way her eyes darted nervously toward a portrait of her late husband that dominated the opposite wall. There was something beyond simple grief in her manner, a quality of suppressed anxiety that suggested hidden knowledge. "Mrs. Pemberton," Inspector Japp began gently, "we appreciate you receiving us during this difficult time. We need to understand more about your husband's recent state of mind and any concerns he might have expressed about his business affairs." "Reginald was always very discreet about his work," she replied, her voice steady despite the evident strain. "He believed that banking required absolute confidentiality, even with family members. But I could tell when something was troubling him." The detective leaned forward with interest. "And recently, madame, you observed such troubles?" "Over the past month, yes. He had been working much later than usual, often not returning home until well past dinner. When he did arrive, he seemed preoccupied and irritable. Several times I found him in his study late at night, reviewing papers and making calculations." She paused to dab at her eyes with a lace handkerchief before continuing. "Last week, he received several telephone calls that clearly disturbed him. I could hear him in his study speaking in raised tones about investments and obligations. It was most unlike his usual professional manner." "Did he mention any specific clients or business concerns?" "He did speak of one gentleman who had been making unreasonable demands. Mr. Blackwood, I believe. Reginald said the man was threatening legal action over some investment losses, though he insisted the losses were due to unavoidable market conditions." The detective exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Japp. "These market conditions, madame, did your husband explain their nature?" Mrs. Pemberton hesitated, then rose and moved to a small escritoire in the corner of the room. From a locked drawer she retrieved a leather portfolio, which she handed to the detective with obvious reluctance. "I found this among Reginald's personal papers in his study here at home. I haven't shown it to anyone else, but perhaps it might be relevant to your investigation." The portfolio contained a series of letters and financial documents that painted a disturbing picture of Pemberton's business practices. Several communications from clients expressed growing concern about investment performance, while others demanded immediate explanations for significant losses in their accounts. Most revealing was a draft letter in Pemberton's own handwriting, apparently never sent, in which he attempted to explain to a client that certain high-risk investments had failed catastrophically. The tone was apologetic but also defensive, suggesting that the client had been adequately warned of the potential risks involved. "Mrs. Pemberton," the detective said carefully, "these documents suggest that your husband's firm was experiencing considerable financial difficulties. Were you aware of the extent of these problems?" "I suspected that business had not been going well," she admitted quietly. "Our own household expenses had become a subject of increasing concern. Reginald had spoken of the need to economize, and he had postponed several planned improvements to our country house." Inspector Japp consulted his notebook. "Did your husband keep any business records here at home, any additional account books or client files?" "He maintained a small safe in his study for particularly sensitive documents, but he was very secretive about its contents, and I don't believe he shared the combination with anyone." The detective requested permission to examine this safe, which proved to be a substantial steel vault built into the wall behind a bookshelf. Unlike the office safe, this one showed clear signs of recent opening, scratches around the lock mechanism and slight scuff marks on the floor where someone had knelt while working on the combination. Inside, they discovered the missing account ledgers from Pemberton's office, carefully arranged and apparently complete. But the detective's trained eye immediately noticed that several pages had been removed from each book, precisely cut out with a sharp knife, leaving only tiny stubs to mark where they had been. "Most interesting," he murmured, examining the mutilated records. "Someone has been very selective about which information they wish to preserve or destroy." Mrs. Pemberton appeared genuinely shocked by the discovery. "I had no idea those books were here. Reginald never mentioned bringing office records home." A closer examination of the surviving pages revealed the scope of the problem facing Pemberton's firm. Multiple client accounts showed substantial losses, with several appearing to have been deliberately manipulated to disguise the true extent of the financial damage. Most significantly, the detective found evidence of funds being transferred between accounts without proper authorization, a clear indication of embezzlement. "Mrs. Pemberton, I must ask about your husband's recent behavior in a different context. Had he seemed fearful or concerned about his personal safety?" "Now that you mention it, yes. He had begun locking doors that were normally left open, and he seemed particularly nervous about visitors. Just last week he installed additional locks on both his office and his study here, and had the alarm system upgraded, as if he expected someone might attempt to break in." "Precisely when?" "When I asked him about it, he simply said that discretion was particularly important, given the sensitive nature of some current business matters." As they prepared to leave, the detective made one final observation that would prove crucial to understanding the case. Among the papers in Pemberton's home study, he had noticed several documents bearing signatures that appeared to have been traced or copied rather than written naturally. "Mrs. Pemberton, was your husband skilled in penmanship? Did he perhaps have experience in document preparation or authentication?" "Oh, yes, quite skilled. Early in his career, he had worked briefly for a firm that specialized in verifying the authenticity of financial documents. He often remarked that forgery was much more common in banking than most people realized." The implication hung heavy in the air as they departed. Reginald Pemberton had possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to manipulate financial records, but someone had discovered his deception and taken final, ritualistic revenge. The coins placed over his eyes were indeed payment for services rendered, the ultimate settlement of a debt that could never be repaid in conventional currency. Chapter 6. The Ink That Betrays. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the forensic specialist consulted by Scotland Yard for document analysis, received them in his laboratory near St. Bartholomew's Hospital, a cramped room filled with microscopes, chemical testing equipment, and samples of paper and ink from around the world, a veritable archive of the forger's art and the methods used to detect it. "Gentlemen, I've completed my preliminary analysis of the documents you provided," Dr. Morrison announced, gesturing toward a collection of papers spread across his examination table. "The results are quite illuminating, though I suspect not entirely unexpected." The detective studied the various account ledgers and correspondence with keen interest, particularly noting the forensic specialist's annotations, marking suspicious elements within seemingly routine financial records. "These signatures, for instance," Dr. Morrison continued, pointing to several authorization forms, "show clear evidence of forgery. Pen pressure variations are wrong, the speed of writing inconsistent with natural penmanship, and most tellingly, there are minute tremors that suggest the signatures were drawn rather than written." Inspector Japp leaned forward to examine the markings more closely. "You're saying Pemberton was forging his client's signatures?" "I'm saying someone was forging them, and doing so quite skillfully. But there are always telltale signs for those who know what to look for. See here, the ink composition varies slightly between authentic signatures and forged ones, suggesting different pens or ink supplies were used at different times." The detective had been examining a series of transfer documents that authorized moving funds between various client accounts. "These particular forgeries, Doctor, they required considerable skill and practice to execute." "Absolutely. This isn't the work of a casual amateur, but someone with extensive experience in document manipulation. The forger had access to authentic samples of each signature, and took considerable time to perfect the reproductions. And the ink analysis. What can you tell us about the timing of these forgeries? Dr. Morrison consulted his notes. Based on the chemical composition and aging characteristics, I'd estimate these documents were created over a period of several months, with the most recent forgeries completed within the past 2 weeks. This timeline aligned perfectly with Mrs. Pemberton's observations about her husband's increasingly stressed behaviour and late working hours. The detective was beginning to see how the various elements of the case fit together into a coherent pattern of deception and retribution. "There's something else," Dr. Morrison added, producing a small glass slide. "I found traces of an unusual ink formulation on some of these documents, a very specific blend that's only available from one supplier in London, Harrington & Sons on Chancery Lane. They cater primarily to legal professionals and document specialists." This information proved crucial when they visited the venerable ink and paper merchants later that afternoon. The elderly proprietor, Mr. James Harrington, kept meticulous records of all customers who purchased specialised inks and papers suitable for document work. "Oh, yes, Mr. Pemberton was a regular customer," Harrington confirmed, consulting his ledger books. "Purchased our finest quality India ink and specialised pens on a monthly basis. Said he needed them for sensitive banking documents that required absolute precision." "And, recently, monsieur, had he made any unusual purchases?" "Matter of fact, yes. Just last week he bought a rather large quantity of sealing wax, our best quality, the kind used for important legal documents. Seemed quite urgent about it, paid extra for immediate preparation." The detective's eyes sharpened, the same sealing wax they had discovered traces of in his office. "Inspector, Mr. Pemberton had been busy sealing documents just before his death." "But here's the interesting thing," Harrington continued. "Mr. Pemberton wasn't my only customer for that particular ink formulation. Another gentleman has been purchasing the same supplies for the past several months, a Mr. Blackwood." The revelation was significant. Cornelius Blackwood had been acquiring the same specialised materials used in the forged documents, suggesting a collaboration with Pemberton, or knowledge of the banker's illicit activities that went far beyond simple client relationships. "This Mr. Blackwood," Inspector Japp asked, "did he seem familiar with document preparation techniques?" "Oh, yes, quite knowledgeable, knew exactly what he wanted and how it should be prepared. Mentioned that he'd done some clerical work in his youth before inheriting his family's properties." The detective requested samples of the specific ink and paper used by both men, intending to compare them more precisely with the forged documents. As they prepared to leave the shop, Mr. Harrington made an additional observation that would prove vital to understanding the case. "Funny thing about Mr. Blackwood's recent purchases, he specifically asked for ink that would fade naturally over time. Said he was working on some temporary documents that needed to appear authentic initially, but then become obviously false after a few weeks. This detail cast an entirely new light on Blackwood's involvement in the case. The detective realised they were dealing not with simple embezzlement, but with an elaborate scheme of deliberate deception designed to expose Pemberton's fraudulent activities through irrefutable evidence. From Chancery Lane, they proceeded directly to Scotland Yard, where the detective requested immediate chemical analysis of all documents found in Pemberton's home safe. The results, available within hours due to the urgency of the murder investigation, confirmed his growing suspicions about the true nature of the crime. The forged signatures on the transfer authorizations had been executed using 2 different ink formulations: Pemberton's permanent ink for documents he intended to preserve, and Blackwood's temporary ink for signatures designed to fade and reveal their fraudulent nature. This suggested a trap had been carefully laid, with Blackwood providing evidence of forgery that would become apparent over time. "Inspector," the detective concluded as they reviewed the laboratory findings, "we are not investigating a simple case of murder motivated by financial losses. Instead, we have here a complex scheme of entrapment and justice. One man's deliberate plan to expose another's criminality through irrefutable evidence." "You mean Blackwood was working to catch Pemberton in the act of embezzlement?" "Precisely. And when confronted with undeniable proof of his crimes, Pemberton chose death over disgrace. But someone else chose to make his death appear as murder, complete with ritualistic elements designed to suggest external retribution rather than suicide." The question remained, Who had transformed Pemberton's suicide into an elaborate murder scene, and why had they gone to such lengths to create this theatrical deception? The answer, the detective suspected, lay in understanding the full extent of Pemberton's crimes and identifying who else might have suffered from his fraudulent schemes. The coins placed over his eyes were indeed payment for the ferryman, but they had been positioned by someone who felt justice required a more dramatic presentation than simple self-destruction could provide. Chapter 7. The Partner's Secret. Mr. James Whitmore had returned from Edinburgh that morning, summoned urgently by news of his business partner's death. The detective found him in the offices of Pemberton and Associates, attempting to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed the firm in the wake of the investigation. Whitmore was a portly gentleman in his late 50s, with the ruddy complexion of someone who enjoyed good living and the anxious manner of a man suddenly confronted with circumstances far beyond his control. He greeted them with barely concealed agitation, his hands constantly moving to adjust his spectacles or shuffle through papers on the desk. "Terrible business, absolutely terrible," he muttered as they settled into chairs in the conference room. "Poor Reginald, and in such circumstances. I can't begin to understand what happened here." The detective observed Whitmore carefully, noting the slight tremor in his voice and the way his eyes avoided direct contact when discussing his partner's recent activities. There was something beyond simple grief and shock in his manner, a quality of guilty knowledge that suggested complicity in matters he preferred not to discuss. "Mr. Whitmore," Inspector Jappy began, "we need to understand the financial condition of your firm and any recent concerns about business practices or client relationships." "Well, naturally, any banking establishment faces challenges in the current economic climate, but I wouldn't characterize our situation as particularly dire. Reginald handled most of the day-to-day client relationships, while I focused primarily on investment strategy and regulatory compliance." This division of responsibilities was significant, the detective realized. It would have allowed Pemberton considerable latitude in managing individual client accounts without Whitmore's direct oversight, creating opportunities for the kind of manipulation they had discovered in the forged documents. These client relationships that Mr. Pemberton managed. Did you review his work regularly? Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We had established procedures, of course, monthly reviews of all major accounts, quarterly assessments of investment performance. But Reginald was extremely capable, and I had complete confidence in his judgment. Even when clients began expressing concerns about investment losses, I wasn't aware that client complaints had become a significant issue. Reginald handled such matters discreetly, as is appropriate in private banking. The detective produced the portfolio of documents they had discovered in Pemberton's home study, including the draft letters and financial records that revealed the extent of the firm's problems. Whitmore's face grew increasingly pale as he examined the evidence. "Good God," he whispered, sinking back in his chair. "I had no idea the situation had deteriorated to such an extent. These losses, these client complaints, Reginald never mentioned anything approaching this scale of difficulty." "Mr. Whitmore, these documents suggest systematic embezzlement over a period of several months. As joint partner in the firm, you would have had access to all account records and transaction histories. How could such activities escape your notice?" Whitmore removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a trembling hand before answering. "Reginald had convinced me that certain investment strategies required absolute confidentiality, even from other partners. He maintained separate records for what he called sensitive transactions, accounts involving clients who demanded complete discretion about their financial affairs." "And you accepted this arrangement without question?" "I trusted him implicitly. We had been partners for over 15 years, and his reputation for integrity was unquestioned throughout the financial community." Inspector Japp consulted his notebook. "Mr. Whitmore, where exactly were you on Monday evening when Mr. Pemberton was killed?" "In Edinburgh, as I mentioned. I had travelled there on Sunday to meet with Scottish investors interested in our services. I was registered at the Caledonian Hotel and dined with potential clients at the Royal Scots Club." The detective made a note to verify these alibis, though Whitmore's genuine shock at discovering the extent of Pemberton's activities suggested he was not directly involved in either the embezzlement or the death. However, his willingness to accept irregular procedures without investigation raised questions about his professional competence and possible negligent oversight. These sensitive transactions that Mr. Pemberton managed, do you know if they involved any specific clients or types of investments? He mentioned working with several clients who required special handling due to their prominence in society or business. Government officials, members of the nobility, that sort of clientele. He said they needed assurance that their financial affairs would remain completely confidential. This explanation was plausible, but also convenient, the detective realized. It would have allowed Pemberton to justify irregular procedures while actually manipulating accounts for his own benefit. The question remained whether Whitmore was genuinely naive or deliberately ignorant about his partner's activities. Mr. Whitmore, in recent weeks, did you notice any changes in Mr. Pemberton's behaviour or mood? Now that you mention it, yes. He had seemed increasingly stressed and withdrawn. I attributed it to the pressures of managing complex client relationships in difficult market conditions. Did he mention any specific concerns about client relations or business security? Whitmore hesitated, then reached into his desk drawer to retrieve a small leather notebook. Actually, there was something. Last month, Reginald asked me to change the locks on our office and install a new safe in his private study. He said he had received some threatening communications from a disgruntled former employee. A former employee. Can you provide more details about this individual? That's just it. When I asked for specifics, so we could involve the authorities if necessary, Reginald became evasive. He said the matter was being handled discreetly, and that involving the police might create unwanted publicity for the firm. The detective exchanged a significant glance with Inspector Japp. This alleged threat from a former employee might have been a fabrication designed to justify increased security measures that would actually facilitate Pemberton's illegal activities by limiting access to his records and movements. As they prepared to leave, Whitmore made one final revelation that would prove crucial to understanding the case. There is one more thing, gentlemen. Yesterday, before I learned of Reginald's death, I received a telegram from a London solicitor requesting an immediate meeting to discuss matters concerning our firm's business practices. The appointment was scheduled for this afternoon. What solicitor? Mr. Jonathan Crawford of Crawford, Hartley & Associates. He specializes in financial crime and regulatory violations. I assume someone has filed a complaint against us. The detective realized they had discovered another key figure in the complex web of deception and justice surrounding Pemberton's death. Someone had been preparing legal action that would have exposed the banker's crimes through official channels, making murder or suicide unnecessary for achieving justice. But if legal remedies were available, why had someone chosen instead to orchestrate such an elaborate theatrical death? Chapter 8. The Lawyer's Revelation. Mr. Jonathan Crawford's offices occupied the second floor of a distinguished Georgian building in Lincoln's Inn. Wood-panelled rooms lined with legal texts and filled with the quiet efficiency of London's legal establishment. The solicitor himself was a thin, precise man in his 40s, with the careful manner of someone accustomed to handling sensitive matters involving fraud and financial misconduct. He received them in his private consultation room, where documents relating to the Pemberton case were arranged in neat stacks across a polished mahogany table. The detective immediately noted that Crawford had been conducting a thorough investigation independent of the police inquiry, with evidence carefully organized and documented according to legal standards. Gentlemen, I must confess that Mr. Pemberton's death has complicated matters considerably, Crawford began, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. I'd been preparing to present evidence of systematic embezzlement that would have resulted in criminal charges being filed within days. Inspector Japp leaned forward with interest. What sort of evidence, Mr. Crawford? Comprehensive documentation of fraudulent transfers, forged authorizations, and misappropriated client funds spanning a period of nearly 8 months. The total amount involved exceeds £50,000, a sum that would have resulted in lengthy imprisonment if Mr. Pemberton had lived to face trial. The detective examined the meticulously prepared legal documents, noting the careful attention to detail and the devastating nature of the evidence Crawford had assembled. This was not speculative accusation, but irrefutable proof of criminal activity supported by expert analysis and witness testimony. How did you come to possess such detailed information about Mr. Pemberton's activities? I was retained by Mr. Cornelius Blackwood approximately 6 weeks ago. He had discovered irregularities in his account and suspected that his investment funds had been deliberately misappropriated. Initially, he sought my advice about civil remedies, but as we investigated further, it became clear that criminal prosecution would be necessary. This revelation cast Blackwood's recent interactions with Pemberton in an entirely new light. His aggressive demands and threats of legal action had been based not on speculation, but on solid evidence of criminal wrongdoing, carefully documented with professional legal assistance. Mr. Blackwood provided you with evidence of these crimes? Initially, yes, but he also agreed to cooperate in gathering additional proof by maintaining his business relationship with Pemberton while documenting fraudulent activities. It was a dangerous strategy that required considerable courage on Mr. Blackwood's part. The detective recalled Blackwood's nervous demeanour during their interview and his obvious anxiety about the investigation. His behaviour now made perfect sense. He had been operating as an undercover investigator, gathering evidence while pretending to remain a trusting client. This cooperation, it involved Mr. Blackwood providing false signatures or authorization for transactions. Crawford nodded gravely. We created a controlled situation where Mr. Pemberton would be tempted to forge Blackwood's signature on transfer documents. Blackwood provided authentic samples but used special ink that would fade over time, making the forgeries obvious and legally inadmissible as evidence. A most ingenious trap, the detective observed, but also one that required Mr. Blackwood to maintain his relationship with a man he knew to be stealing from him. Indeed, and the strain was considerable. Blackwood reported that Pemberton had become increasingly suspicious and aggressive in recent weeks, particularly after discovering that some of his forged documents were beginning to show signs of tampering. Inspector Japp consulted his notes. Mr. Crawford, did you advise Mr. Blackwood to confront Pemberton directly about these crimes? Absolutely not. Our legal strategy required maintaining the appearance of a normal client relationship until we could present complete evidence to the authorities. Direct confrontation would have allowed Pemberton to destroy evidence or flee before charges could be filed. Yet, we know that Blackwood did meet with Pemberton on Friday, and the discussion was reportedly heated. Crawford's expression grew troubled. Yes, that meeting was not authorized as part of our investigation. Blackwood contacted me afterward to report that Pemberton had become aware of our activities and had made threats of violence if legal action proceeded. What sort of threats? Pemberton claimed that criminal charges would destroy not only his own reputation, but that of other innocent parties associated with the firm. He specifically mentioned that Mr. Whitmore's family would suffer social and financial ruin if the scandal became public. The detective realized they had uncovered the crucial pressure point that had driven events toward their tragic conclusion. Pemberton had not been facing simple criminal prosecution, but the destruction of relationships and reputations that extended far beyond his own interests. Mr. Crawford, in your professional opinion, was Mr. Pemberton the type of individual who might choose suicide rather than face public disgrace? Based on his behavior during our investigation, I would say it was entirely possible. He had built his entire identity around his reputation for integrity and discretion. The prospect of criminal trial and imprisonment would have been devastating to someone of his psychological makeup. And yet, the detective mused, someone transformed what might have been suicide into an elaborate murder scene. Someone who felt that simple self-destruction was insufficient justice for Pemberton's crimes. Crawford produced a final document from his files, a detailed accounting of all clients who had suffered losses due to Pemberton's embezzlement. The list included nearly 20 individuals and families, representing a broad cross-section of London's financial elite. Any one of these victims might have felt that Pemberton's death should appear as murder rather than suicide, Crawford observed. They had lost not only their investments, but their trust in institutions they had considered absolutely reliable. The detective studied the list carefully, noting that several names were familiar from London's social and business circles. Among them was one entry that immediately caught his attention: a Miss Margaret Blackwood, listed as having lost her entire dowry settlement just weeks before her marriage to Lord Ashford. The family connections were becoming clearer, and with them the personal motivations that had transformed a financial crime into a ritualistic execution. The coins placed over Pemberton's eyes were not random symbolism, but carefully chosen payment for specific debts that could never be repaid in conventional currency. Someone had ensured that Reginald Pemberton's death would serve both punishment and warning, a theatrical demonstration that certain violations of trust demanded public justice rather than private despair. Chapter 9. The Daughter's Dowry. The revelation that Margaret Blackwood, now Lady Ashford, had been among Pemberton's victims added a deeply personal dimension to the case that the detective had not previously considered. The theft of a young woman's dowry just before her wedding represented not merely financial crime, but an attack on family honour and social standing that would demand the most serious response. Lady Ashford received them in the elegant drawing room of the Ashford townhouse in Mayfair, where she had been staying since her recent marriage. She was a strikingly beautiful young woman in her early 20s, with the refined bearing of someone born to privilege, but also a steely determination in her eyes that spoke of strength beneath her delicate appearance. "Gentlemen," she began, before they could state their business, "I assume you wish to discuss my father's financial affairs and their connection to Mr. Pemberton's death. I can save you considerable time by stating that I am fully aware of the circumstances surrounding both matters." The detective was immediately impressed by her directness. "Lady Ashford, we understand that you suffered personal losses due to Mr. Pemberton's illegal activities." "That is correct. My dowry settlement, which represented the entirety of my personal inheritance from my maternal grandmother, was invested with Pemberton and Associates at my father's recommendation. The funds disappeared completely over the course of several months, apparently transferred to cover losses in other clients' accounts." Inspector Japp made a note. "How did you discover that your funds had been misappropriated?" "My father informed me of his suspicions several weeks ago, after he began investigating irregularities in his own account. When we demanded a full accounting from Mr. Pemberton, he provided documents that later proved to be fraudulent." The detective studied her carefully, noting the controlled anger beneath her composed exterior. "This must have created considerable distress, especially so close to your wedding date." "The financial loss was devastating, but the breach of trust was worse. Mr. Pemberton had been managing my family's investments for over a decade. We considered him a friend as well as a business associate." "Lady Ashford, did you or your father confront Mr. Pemberton directly about these losses?" She hesitated for a moment, then rose and moved to a writing desk in the corner of the room. From a locked drawer she retrieved a small leather journal, which she handed to the detective with obvious reluctance. "This contains a record of all my interactions with Mr. Pemberton over the past 2 months, including several meetings where I attempted to recover my funds through negotiation rather than legal action." The journal revealed a pattern of increasingly desperate attempts by Lady Ashford to resolve the matter privately, motivated by concerns about the social scandal that would result from public accusations against a prominent banker. She had offered to accept partial repayment, forgive interest charges, and even provide additional time for Pemberton to arrange restitution. "These final entries," the detective observed, "suggest that Mr. Pemberton refused all your reasonable proposals." "More than refused. He became abusive and threatening. During our last meeting, he suggested that my reputation would suffer more than his if the matter became public, implying that people would assume I had been somehow complicit in the fraudulent transactions." This threat would have been particularly devastating to a young woman entering London's highest social circles through marriage, the detective realised. Pemberton had not merely stolen Lady Ashford's inheritance, but had attempted to use her social vulnerability to ensure her silence about his crimes. "Lady Ashford, where were you on Monday evening when Mr. Pemberton was killed?" "At home with my husband, hosting a dinner party for 8 guests. The evening began at 7 and continued until nearly midnight." "I can provide you with a complete list of attendees if necessary." The alibi was solid, but the detective noted that Lady Ashford had anticipated the question and prepared her response with careful precision. Someone with her intelligence and social connections would have had no difficulty arranging such an alibi if she had been planning to take action against Pemberton. "Did you discuss Mr. Pemberton's crimes with other family members or friends?" "Only with my father and my husband. Lord Ashford was naturally concerned about the financial implications, But he also felt that justice required more than simple restitution. What did he mean by that? Lady Ashford's composure wavered slightly. My husband comes from a family with very traditional views about honour and justice. He felt that someone who would steal a woman's dowry deserved public disgrace rather than quiet settlement. The detective exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Japp. Lord Ashford's traditional views might well have included familiarity with classical concepts of justice, including the symbolic significance of placing coins over the eyes of the dead. Lady Ashford, is your husband knowledgeable about ancient burial customs or classical literature? Certainly. He received a classical education at Eton and Oxford, with particular emphasis on Greek and Latin studies. He often remarks on the superiority of ancient concepts of justice compared to modern legal procedures. This educational background would have provided both knowledge of the symbolic meaning of the coins and the cultural context necessary to appreciate their significance as a statement about justice and retribution. Where is Lord Ashford now? We would like to speak with him. He left this morning for his estate in Yorkshire. Some urgent matter concerning the tenant farmers required his immediate attention. She paused, then added quietly, "He departed quite suddenly, without his usual preparations for an extended stay in the country." The timing of Lord Ashford's departure was highly suspicious, occurring just hours after news of Pemberton's death had become public knowledge, the detective realized. They needed to locate and interview the young nobleman immediately, before he could disappear entirely, or establish an elaborate alibi for his activities on Monday evening. As they prepared to leave, Lady Ashford made one final observation that confirmed the detective's growing suspicions about the case. "Gentlemen, I want you to know that whoever killed Mr. Pemberton performed a service to society. That man destroyed lives and betrayed trust with no regard for the consequences to his victims. If justice required dramatic presentation to ensure the world understood the nature of his crimes, then I support whoever had the courage to provide it." Her words carried the conviction of someone who had suffered deeply and who viewed Pemberton's theatrical death not as murder but as appropriate punishment for unforgivable crimes. The detective realized they were dealing with a concept of justice that transcended legal procedures and demanded symbolic satisfaction for wounds that could never be healed through conventional means. The coins over Pemberton's eyes were indeed payment to the ferryman, but they had been placed by someone who believed that certain debts could only be settled through ritualistic demonstration of divine retribution. Chapter 10. The Final Payment. Lord Ashford's Yorkshire estate proved to be a sprawling Gothic manor house set amid rolling hills and ancient oak forests, its grey stone walls and imposing towers speaking of centuries of family tradition and aristocratic privilege. The detective and Inspector Japp arrived in the late afternoon after a hurried train journey north that had been marked by growing tension and anticipation. They found the young nobleman in his library, a magnificent room lined with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a massive fireplace where logs crackled warmly against the October chill. Lord Ashford was a tall, distinguished man in his late 20s, with the classical features and assured bearing that came from generations of breeding and education. He greeted them with polite courtesy, but also with the wary alertness of someone who had been expecting their visit. The detective noted immediately that, despite his apparent calm, there were subtle signs of strain, shadows under his eyes, a slight tremor in his hands, and the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed his responses to anticipated questions. "Gentlemen, I assume your visit concerns the unfortunate death of Mr. Pemberton. A shocking business, though I confess I cannot claim to mourn the loss of a man who had caused such distress to my family." Inspector Japp consulted his notebook. "Lord Ashford, we need to verify your whereabouts on Monday evening, when Mr. Pemberton was killed." "I was here at Ashford Hall, as I am most evenings. I dined alone and spent the evening in this library reviewing estate accounts and correspondence. My staff can confirm my presence, though I saw no one after dismissing my valet at approximately 9. The detective had been examining the extensive collection of classical texts that lined the library walls, noting particularly a section devoted to ancient Greek and Roman literature, including several volumes on funeral customs and burial practices. "Lord Ashford, you have an impressive collection of classical works. I see here several books dealing with ancient burial rituals and their symbolic significance." Indeed, classical studies were my primary focus at university, and I continue to find the wisdom of the ancients relevant to modern circumstances. There is much to be learned from how previous civilizations dealt with questions of justice and retribution, including, perhaps, the practice of placing coins over the eyes of the dead. Lord Ashford's composure slipped almost imperceptibly. That particular custom, yes, it represents the soul's payment to Charon for passage across the river Styx, a beautiful metaphor for the transition from earthly concerns to eternal judgment. The detective moved to a writing desk positioned near one of the tall windows, noting the quality of the paper and ink supplies arranged there. Among them was a stick of sealing wax that appeared to match the traces found in Pemberton's office. "You correspond frequently with business associates in London?" "Certainly. Managing extensive properties requires constant communication with agents, solicitors and financial advisors." "Including communication with Mr. Pemberton before his death?" Lord Ashford hesitated, then moved to a locked drawer in the desk. From it he retrieved a small collection of letters that he handed to the detective with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Pemberton and I had been corresponding about my wife's financial losses. I had demanded full restitution and threatened legal action if he failed to comply with my requirements." The letters revealed the full extent of Lord Ashford's anger about Pemberton's crimes and his determination to achieve justice through whatever means necessary. The tone progressed from formal business courtesy to barely controlled fury as Pemberton continued to evade responsibility for his actions. The final letter, dated just 3 days before Pemberton's death, contained language that could only be interpreted as a direct threat. "If legal remedies prove insufficient, I shall be obliged to seek satisfaction through more traditional means. A gentleman's honour, once compromised, demands restoration, regardless of the personal cost involved." "Lord Ashford," the detective said carefully, "this correspondence suggests that you were prepared to take direct action against Mr. Pemberton if he refused to make restitution." "I was prepared to defend my family's honour, yes, but I had hoped that reason and legal pressure would prove sufficient to resolve the matter without resort to more dramatic measures." Inspector Japp leaned forward. "Are you confessing to the murder of Reginald Pemberton?" Lord Ashford was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire before responding. "I am confessing to ensuring that justice was served in a manner appropriate to the gravity of the crimes committed. Mr. Pemberton had betrayed the trust of numerous families, stolen funds that represented years of savings and careful planning, and shown no remorse for the devastation he had caused." "So you travelled to London on Monday evening and confronted him in his office?" "I arrived in London early that morning and spent the day observing Pemberton's office, learning his routines and determining the best approach. I knew that direct confrontation during business hours would be impossible, so I waited until evening, when he would be alone with his ledgers and his guilt." The detective had been studying Lord Ashford's demeanour throughout this conversation, noting the careful choice of words and the deliberate pacing of his revelations. "You gained entry to his office using knowledge obtained from your wife about his business practices." Margaret had mentioned that Pemberton often worked late on Monday evenings, reviewing the previous week's transactions. She also knew about his habit of keeping a spare key in the outer office safe, information she had gleaned during her attempts to negotiate privately for return of her dowry. "And once inside his office?" Lord Ashford's voice grew quieter, taking on an almost confessional quality. "I found him exactly as expected, hunched over his account books, attempting to manipulate the figures to disguise his thefts. I confronted him with evidence of his crimes and demanded immediate confession and restitution." "How did he respond?" "With arrogance and threats. He claimed that exposure of his activities would destroy innocent parties, including my wife's reputation. He suggested that public accusations would make her appear complicit in his schemes." The detective could see how such threats would have provoked a man of Lord Ashford's temperament and social position. The suggestion that Lady Ashford might be implicated in financial fraud would have been intolerable to someone raised with traditional concepts of family honour. "What happened then?" I informed him that he would provide written confession and complete restitution, or face the consequences of his refusal. When he continued to refuse and became abusive in his language about my wife, I lost my temper." "You killed him." I struck him once, intending only to discipline his insolence, but he fell backward, striking his head on the corner of his desk. The blow proved fatal. Inspector Japp made careful notes as Lord Ashford continued his confession. And afterward, why did you arrange the scene to appear as deliberate murder? Because simple accident seemed insufficient justice for the magnitude of his crimes. I wanted the world to understand that Reginald Pemberton had faced judgment for his actions, that someone had held him accountable for the lives he had destroyed. So, you placed the gold sovereigns over his eyes as payment to Karen. Yes, and as a symbol that his debts had finally been settled, though not in the currency he preferred to steal. The detective nodded slowly, understanding at last the complete picture of events that had led to Pemberton's theatrical death. Lord Ashford had not planned murder, but had found himself compelled to ensure that justice appeared deliberate and symbolic, rather than accidental. Lord Ashford, why did you take the account ledgers from Pemberton's office? To ensure that evidence of his crimes would be preserved, and that other victims would be able to recover their losses. I delivered them to Mr. Crawford this morning, along with instructions that they be used to trace and recover all misappropriated funds. As Inspector Japp placed Lord Ashford under arrest for the murder of Reginald Pemberton, the detective reflected on the whole complex moral questions raised by the case. A man had died, but justice had been served in a manner that ensured his victims would recover their losses and understand that their suffering had been acknowledged and avenged. The coins placed over Pemberton's eyes had indeed been payment to the ferryman, but they had also been a final statement about the price of betraying trust and the traditional obligations of honour that transcended legal procedures. In the end, the detective thought, some debts could only be settled with the currency of the dead, gold sovereigns that gleamed like closed eyes, carrying their silent message across the river that separates justice from revenge, punishment from retribution, and the world of the living from the eternal realm where all accounts are finally balanced. And so concludes our tale of the coins on the dead man's eyes. I'm Stephen, and thank you for joining Cozy Mysteries today. Until next time, remember that in the world of detection, the smallest details often reveal the largest truths, and justice sometimes wears masks we don't expect.